This is the only place in the world where meetings start early. Normally, it's late. Thank you very much for those two introductory patters. This is an unusual meeting in that the topic is consciousness, and their speakers, not all of whom are psychoanalysts or psychoanalytical people with psychoanalytical backgrounds, as far as I understand. I myself, of course, am a psychoanalyst, but the topic of consciousness is something which is really a very hot subject in neuroscience today, and indeed in philosophy today. So I'm going to approach the subject not only from a psychoanalytic point of view, but situating my own psychoanalytical mind within that broader setting. The other way in which this is unusual is that my paper is going to be spread over 2 days. I'm starting today and I'm finishing tomorrow. So I'm speaking from 5 o'clock. I'm just going slowly till 5 o'clock happens. From 5 o'clock until 6:15, and I will leave at least 15 minutes for discussion. So in other words, I will speak at the most, I'll speak for 1 hour. And then tomorrow I'll speak for another hour. So I'm not exactly sure where in my presentation we will end. So I will try to, as I see the clock, I'll try to find a good moment to end, and then we'll simply carry on tomorrow. I'm very glad to have so much time to talk to you, because it really is an extremely complicated and wide-ranging subject. And I would hate to have to rush through all of the complexities in an unrealistic amount of time. But I'm grateful to have this time for another reason also, and that is that I have just been working on this topic. In fact, I've just finished writing a book on it. For the last 7 weeks, I was in rural bliss in Sussex, in England, in what they call splendid isolation, writing. And my mind is full of every complicated detail to do with that book. And now I have to start trying to decant it and trying to simplify it and trying to sketch the big picture. So to have the luxury of 2 hours for doing that makes it a lot easier than it would otherwise have been. Especially since I'm going to be presenting at the big Consciousness Congress in Interlaken in Switzerland in June. They have every year, the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness has a big congress. And there I've been given 45 minutes. So this is my trial run. I'm going to see how can I possibly fit all of this into a lecture format, having the luxury of, in fact, double the amount of time that one normally gets. And then, so you're my guinea pigs, and then I'll use it from that, from my experience with you, I'll use this as a basis for deciding what else can I cut out in order to sketch the thing just in headline terms. I'm going to speak very freely because I have all of this time. I'm going to just see how it goes, and in that respect, again, as I said, you are my test audience. So let's see how it goes. My topic in the program is a neuropsychoanalytic perspective on the hard problem. That's really a description of what I'm going to be doing. It's not a formal title. Here's my formal title: Why and How Consciousness Arises. That's the question that I'm going to be addressing, and the reason that I've put it in those particular words will become clear to you as we go along. I will explain. Now I just need to try and work out how to make these slides go forwards. I guess it's this. Aha, okay. So I told you I've just written, well, I haven't yet submitted it to the publishers. So I don't mean written in the sense of published, but I've just finished actually writing a book on this topic that will come out at the end of this year or the beginning of next year with the title Consciousness Itself. But I have recently published 2 articles on the topic, And I thought I'll put those on the screen because although I have 2 hours, and I keep telling you how grateful I am for that, nevertheless, it still is very complicated, very technical. A lot of what I'm going to be touching upon is really unsuitable for oral presentation, especially the mathematical side and the physics side of things. It's really not possible to dig into all of that in a lecture format. So if anybody is interested in the technicalities and wants to dig more deeply into it, please read one of these 2 papers. The one at the top is Journal of Consciousness Studies, and I'll explain in a moment why I published it in that journal. But that journal, sadly, is not online, so it's quite difficult to get. This journal here is online and open access, Frontiers in Psychology. So that's the easiest one to read. It's also the easiest one to read in the sense that it's written for people without a mathematics or physics education. So that's easier to understand for people from the health sciences and from the psychological disciplines. But if you're wanting to, and you have a background in, and you're particularly interested in the mathematics and physics of it, then the first paper is the one that you should read. Okay, here we go. The reason that I framed, I want to tell you something else first. Because as I told you, I am a psychoanalyst and I come at this from the point of view of a psychoanalyst, but my presentation is not only psychoanalytical, it's setting the problem in a much wider context. I wanted to start by giving you something of the historical background so that you can see where psychoanalysis fits in this bigger picture. Here is the beginning of the historical background. There was this famous physiologist, Johannes Müller, whose name is associated with a school of medicine or a school of biology called vitalism. Vitalism boils down to the idea that there is a vital energy, a life force, which distinguishes living creatures from all other physical entities. Johannes Müller was of the view that you can't use physics and chemistry and the like alone in order to understand a living creature. That there's something else that is added. There's something special about living things which requires something more. And he was not able to specify what this something else is, except to say that there is a vital energy or a life force which cannot be reduced to physics and chemistry, but beyond that he wasn't able to specify what it was. He said many things on this topic, but that's about the briefest, pithiest example of it that I could find for you. Living organisms are fundamentally different from non-living entities because they contain some non-physical element or are governed by different principles than are inanimate things. So that's our starting point. Is this true? Is it possible to reduce living creatures to the basic laws of physics and chemistry, or is something else required? Müller had many brilliant students, and among his most brilliant students were these 2 guys, Émile Dubois-Reymond and Ernst von Brücke. Perhaps his most brilliant student was Hermann von Helmholtz. And these 3, not only these 3, there was also Ludwig. There were many brilliant people in this group. They were all pupils of his, or at least the founding members of this group were all pupils of Müller's. And their society that they established was called the Berlin Physical Society. And their starting point was that they wanted to prove their teacher wrong. They revered him. Müller was greatly loved. He was greatly admired. But these young men believed surely it is possible to reduce the the understanding of biology and of physiology, surely there can't be some special force that distinguishes living creatures from non-living things. Everything must ultimately be reducible to the laws of physics and chemistry. And so they set up this society called, as I said, the Berlin Physical Society, with that aim in mind. That's what they wanted to prove. And here's this famous oath. Émile Dubois-Reymond said that he and Ernst von Brücke swore this oath that I have on the screen here. That their oath was, no other forces than the common physical and chemical ones are active within the organism. In those cases which cannot currently be explained by these forces, one has either to find the specific way or form of their action by means of the physical mathematical method, or to assume new forces equal in dignity to the chemical physical forces inherent in matter, reducible to the forces of attraction and repulsion. So this is the great sort of reductionist, materialist agenda that started with this famous oath in 1842 and really has set the stage for everything that has come since in modern medicine. Now, some of you, perhaps many of you, will recognize the names that I've mentioned. The outstanding one for those of us who are psychoanalysts is Brücke. Brücke was a professor of Freud's, and Freud admired him greatly. And those of you who have read Freud's autobiographical study will see there, he says that he held Brücke as a model it was an intellectual ideal for the young Freud. He had very, very high regard for him. And it's in this context, I think, quite reasonable to assume that it was in this context that he wrote, Freud did, his famous Project for a Scientific Psychology in 1895, which I will now show you the opening sentence, and you'll recognize that it really is the same project as the project of the Berlin Physical Society. Except here it's not a matter of reducing the organism, the living things, to physics and chemistry and mathematics, but the mind itself, perhaps the most difficult aspect of the living creature to reduce to physics and chemistry. Freud wished to do that in his project. And he said in the opening sentence, the intention is to furnish a psychology that shall be a natural science. That is, to represent psychical processes as quantitatively determinate states, in other words, mathematically definable, quantitatively determinate states of specifiable material particles, in other words, reducible to physics and chemistry, thus making those processes perspicuous and free from contradiction. The implication, of course, is that if you don't do this, then you do not have a natural science of psychology, that you do not have a psychology that is perspicuous and free from contradiction. So this is what the young Freud tried to do in 1895. He tried to reduce the mind to physics, chemistry, and mathematics. Now, you all know that he abandoned this task. By 1896, what's going to happen?
To lower down the light.
Oh, that's what I asked when I stood up here. I said, "Is it too bright?"
Yes, sir, but I don't know where it is.
Is it not here? Probably.
Ah.
Is it better? Sorry.
That's good. Great. Freud was absolutely euphoric as he was writing this thing. He kept on writing to Fliess and telling him how brilliant it was and how excited he was and how the thing really seems to be a machine that will run of itself and so on, as he was trying to reduce the mind to physical and mathematically lawful principles. But by 1896, he became very despondent and decided it wasn't possible. And he abandoned his project. In abandoning his project, he shifted over to psychoanalysis proper, and he introduced this new word, meta-psychology. In other words, the theory, the basic theory of psychoanalysis. And the word meta-psychology refers to what lies behind consciousness, meta-psychology, behind consciousness, trying to infer laws using really what this method that Dubois-Reymond said, that if you can't do this, if you can't reduce it to chemical and physical forces, then you must at least assume new forces that are equal in dignity. So I think that this is what Freud did. His ideas of drive and psychical energy and cathexis and the mental structure of the ego and the id and all of these sorts of things, they were attempts to come up with abstract laws, abstract forces and energies and structures which at least have the trappings of a natural science. Even though it's not yet possible to define these things in physical terms and it's not yet possible to quantify them, still at least they are equal in dignity. And Freud's moving beyond consciousness, in other words, beyond the phenomenal surface, trying to infer the abstract forces that lie behind it, the laws governing appearances. It was very much in this tradition of the Berlin Physical Society. But it was, I'm sure, a great disappointment and frustration to Freud that he was never able to actually achieve the oath that Reymond and Brücke swore allegiance to in 1842. Now, there's a sort of a fond belief among psychoanalysts that Freud then abandoned science or abandoned neuroscience or abandoned the physical and went into a purely mental science as if this was some sort of liberation for him. But I say again, it was a disappointment for him. It was a frustration for him. I'm glad that Irit mentioned that I've translated Freud's works. I really know Freud's works, believe me. And he says all over the place that it's a temporary thing that we'll have a pure psychology, that we must have a pure psychology because it's the only way that we can establish this field on empirical ground. The only observations we can make are psychological ones because we do not have any methods to understand how these things relate to physiology and anatomy, let alone physics, chemistry, and mathematics. But that's not that Freud became an idealist or became a dualist. It's not that he abandoned that aspiration. It was a temporary strategy. It was very, very certainly Freud's view on the matter because, as I say, he repeats this over and over again, that one day it will become possible to rejoin a psychoanalysis with the neurosciences. It will become possible to translate everything that we've learned psychologically about the laws governing this part of nature that we call mental life, that it will become possible to reunite it with the sciences that he had so reluctantly to abandon in the 1890s. So I'm sketching this whole background, as I said, to situate the project that I'm about to describe to you within its greater historical context, but also to make this grandiose, perhaps, claim that what I am trying to do is to complete that project. I think we are now at a point in the history of the medical sciences, and in particular of the neurosciences, that the time that Freud imagined one day would come really is upon us. It has come. It is now possible to make links between the forces and energies and structures and laws that Freud discerned on purely psychological grounds and in purely psychological terms. It is now possible to begin to try to link these with anatomy and physiology, and beyond that, perhaps even with physics and chemistry, and ultimately perhaps possible to reduce this all to quantifiable laws, just as Freud had hoped to do in the opening sentence of his Project for a Scientific Psychology. So that's the very broad backdrop behind which what I'm now going to tell you is set. So I now move into the beginnings of my presentation proper. Here is a summary of what I'm going to do. And when I say this is what I'm going to do, it's what I'm going to do over these 2 sessions. So I'm not sure how far I'll get today. I'll have to time myself tomorrow according to how far I got today. Well, you can't make the presentation carry on into November. But I know we're having another meeting in November, and perhaps it'll be possible to go more deeply into one or another aspect of it, or to tell you what's happened since February. But these 8 points are what I'm going to cover now and tomorrow. I'm going to start out by telling you what the hard problem is. There is something called the hard problem of consciousness. When I said that consciousness is a very hot topic in neuroscience and in philosophy, it's this hard problem of consciousness that I'm referring to. So I'm going to start out by telling you what the hard problem is. Then I have to make some philosophical comments. That's the second point. It's not possible to avoid philosophy when you speak about the relationship of the mental to the physical. So I'm going to address some points there. Then I'm going to address this question under point 3, which might seem to you to be a very bizarre question. Who would ever ask, is consciousness not a cognitive function? But you will see that some of the leading philosophers in this field are claiming exactly that consciousness is not a cognitive function, that it's not possible to reduce consciousness to any functional laws, that consciousness by definition is something different, it's something phenomenal, something which can't be reduced to functionalism, can't be reduced to abstract laws. So I will address that question and then move on to point 4 and partly explain why the philosophers are saying the things that they are about consciousness. I think it helps us very much to remind ourselves that cognition, this thing which they're saying consciousness is not a cognitive function, I think that part of the reason why they're saying that, why they're obliged to say this, why they find themselves in this corner, is because cognition is actually mainly an unconscious thing. And that's why it's very hard to understand consciousness by looking at cognition. And that leads me to my 5th point, which is that this is because consciousness is in fact an affective function, fundamentally, rather than a cognitive function. And I think that this is probably the single most important point which changes the story, which changes the game, which enables us to understand consciousness in a way that leads us out of the morass of the hard problem of consciousness. I'll then go on to point 6 and explain something about the functional laws that lie behind affects, the functional laws, therefore, that lie behind consciousness, if you accept my argument that consciousness is something fundamentally affective. Then I'm going to move on to addressing, having done that, having spoken about consciousness in relation to affect, I'm then going to return under point 7 to the other side of the equation, that is to cognition, going back from affect back to cognition. And I'm going to argue something about what the function of cognition is in relation to affect, and in the 8th point, that will be the main, that will be my main topic. It will be to understand, explain what is the role of consciousness in cognition, which is the same thing as to say what is the role of affect in cognition. That's how I'm going to bring these two things back together again. So there you have it. That's the outline of what I'm going to speak about. And I myself have no idea how far I'm going to get today, but I hope very much to get at least roughly halfway. So we start with the first point, the hard problem. What is the hard problem of consciousness? Well, it was formulated in 1995 by a philosopher of mind named David Chalmers. And David Chalmers published this article in 1995 in the Journal of Consciousness Studies. And that's why I told you I would explain why the paper that I published in 2018 was published in that journal, even though you can't get it online. That's why. It's because I wanted to answer David Chalmers, and so we answered him in his own journal. Here is what David Chalmers said in that article. Well, this is not the whole article. This is the part of it that I want to draw to your attention. It's a famous statement. He says, it's undeniable that some organisms are subjects of experience. But the question of how it is that these systems are subjects of experience is perplexing. Why is it that when our cognitive systems engage in visual and auditory information processing, we have visual or auditory experience? The quality of deep blue, the sensation of middle sea. How can we explain why there is something it is like to entertain a mental image or experience an emotion? It's widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of how and why it so arises. This is the hard problem of consciousness. And there you have the title, the formal title of my presentation at the end of Chalmers's, this quotation from Chalmers, that we have no good explanation of how and why it so arises. This is why I'm giving you the title, How and Why Consciousness Arises, is what I'm speaking to. So it is meant, this paper that I'm presenting to you in these two sessions, it's meant to be explicitly an attempt to answer this question. It's an attempt to answer this question posed for us by David Chalmers. Experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of how and why it so arises. I want to, before moving on, I want to draw your attention to this sentence, this phrase here. There is something it is like to entertain a mental image. This phrase, there is something it is like. It has a qualitative feel. There's a phenomenological experience of consciousness. It's this thing that is the nub of the hard problem. How does this arise from physical matter? This is the crux of the hard problem. Physical, objective things that we see out there in the world, how on earth do they give rise to this subjective, qualitative feel of experience? How does this happen, and why does it happen, is the hard problem of consciousness. Now, although this paper was published in 1995, of course, this is not the beginning of our attempt to address this question. In fact, this question goes back probably to the beginning of thought. It is one of the most profound questions. How does my soul relate to my mortal flesh? It is one of the most heartfelt of questions that each and every one of us, if we're capable of thinking, aware of ourselves existing in the world, it's a question that at some point, probably pretty early on, is going to occur to us. Me, my beloved self, my experiential being in the world, how does it relate to the physical, anatomical entity of my body, especially considering the fact that it's very obvious from everyone else around me that we die like flies and that they seem to disappear. Where do their souls go to? What is the relationship of it to the body is, as you know, the basis of many a philosophical and religious system. So it's an ancient question. What makes Chalmers special is nothing much really, except that he said this with this very pithy phrase. He said it's the hard problem, and he distinguished it from the easy problem. Now, the timing was everything. In the 1990s, neuroscience was just beginning to come to grips with this problem, and it was perhaps more famously than anyone else Sir Francis Crick, who published this book in 1994 called The Astonishing Hypothesis. And the subtitle of his book was The Scientific Search for the Soul. And the astonishing hypothesis was that you, and I'm quoting Crick now, believe it or not, I can actually remember it. Crick says, you, your joys and your sorrows, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact nothing more than a vast assemblage of neurons and their associated molecules. This was his astonishing hypothesis, that you are actually just neurons and connected up, and the neurotransmitters being transmitted between them. That ultimately that's all you are. It's not such an astonishing hypothesis, but you know, you don't win Nobel Prizes without being a drama queen. I know you're wrong. So Crick, with his great fame, said this in this dramatic way, and started a tradition in neuroscience around that time that all we have to do, using the technologies that we have available to us these days, is identify what in the brain is going on when it's conscious, which is not there when it's not conscious. In taking vision, for example, and Crick did use vision as his example, his model example, because look at your consciousness, it's dominated by vision. And we know a hell of a lot about the brain mechanisms of vision. So Crick said, well, let's take vision, for example. There is such a thing as unconscious vision. There's lots and lots of evidence that it's possible to see without being aware that you're seeing. And there is another thing that we all know called conscious vision. And so let's take these two things and look at what's going on in the brain when you're seeing consciously versus what's going on in the brain when you're seeing unconsciously, subtract the one from the other, and that difference between the two must be the brain functions that produce consciousness, or at least visual consciousness, and then we should be able to generalize from that to understanding consciousness as a whole. So Crick said all we need to do is find the neural correlate of consciousness, the neural correlate of visual consciousness, and from that we can extrapolate. The NCC was the acronym that was given to this neural correlate of consciousness that Crick said we have the tools to find, and once we have found it, we then have the basis for a natural scientific understanding of how and why consciousness arises. It was that prompted Chalmers to formulate the problem in the terms that he did. He said, that's not the problem. That's the easy problem. It's easy to draw correlations, to say this is going on in the brain, in the visual cortex, when this is going on in your mind, called visual consciousness. These two things correlate with each other. But that's easy, says Chalmers. Actually, those of us who do brain research know it's not that easy, but at least it's possible to do that. That's true. To draw these correlations seems like a reasonable strategy, given the technologies that we have available. But Chalmers' point was, that's easy compared to the hard problem. The hard problem is not to identify what is going on in the brain while you're having an experience. The hard problem is, how does that stuff going on in the brain turn into an experience? That's the hard problem, says Chalmers. So it was that, what drew such attention to Chalmers' paper was not the fact that he was addressing this question of how does the body relate to the soul, so much as that he was challenging neuroscience and saying, try and solve that. What you guys are doing is not really the thing that we are asking. Us metaphysicians, us philosophers are asking a very different question from the one that you're addressing. So when I say to you that in this presentation to you, I want to address the hard problem, now you know what I'm talking about. I want to address that question. As Chalmers has formulated it, it's not a matter of correlation. It's a matter of cause. And it's a matter of explaining how and why do those brain processes cause those subjective experiences. And remember all the time, there are echoes in all of what I'm saying to you of that background history. I'm not going to keep repeating that, but please hold it in the back of your minds. That was the opening sentence of Freud's project. He wanted to explain that. How, you remember what he said, he wants to reduce to physical, quantifiable, material particles so that we can have a natural science of the mind. He wants to explain the mind, that is to say consciousness, ultimately in terms of these physical, chemical, mathematically quantifiable processes. That was what Freud tried to do in 1895 and what he abandoned. And it's what Chalmers tells us 100 years later, still nobody has even begun to solve that problem. In fact, as you will see as I go along, Chalmers was chastising neuroscientists for not even trying to solve that problem. They don't even understand what the problem is that they're supposed to be addressing, says Chalmers. Okay, so there you have it. This is the famous hard problem. Now, I told you Chalmers was not the first person to say this. He just said it in this pithy way and at this very unique moment in the history of the problem because neuroscience was trying to tackle it. But his major predecessor for the way in which he formulated the problem was this philosopher, Thomas Nagel. Nagel, but he calls it Nagel. He published this famous paper in 1974 about what is it like to be a bat. And in that paper, I've extracted these two sentences just to show you the background from which Chalmers' question arises. So this is Nagel speaking. He says, if we acknowledge that a physical theory of mind must account for the subjective character of experience, we must admit that no presently available conception gives us a clue about how this could be done. I've underlined the word a clue. That's not Nagel. I'll tell you in a moment why I've underlined it. He then says later in the paper, an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something that it is like to be that organism, something it is like for the organism. So you see that something that it's like, that's it came up in Chalmers' definition of the problem. There's something it is like to entertain a mental image. How does this quality, this experiential, phenomenal quality of consciousness, how does this arise? That's the hard problem of consciousness. And Nagel is telling us that an organism is only conscious if it has this quality of something that it's like to be that organism. There's a quality, a subjective feel to being the organism. Nagel says only if there's that can you say that it's conscious. Something it's like to be the organism for the organism. Okay, so you can see that that's the very same problem that Chalmers is asking us, challenging us to solve, in fact, daring us to even try to solve, and more or less saying it can't be done. When my co-author Carl Friston and I submitted our paper to Chalmers' journal, the Journal of Consciousness Studies, in which we tried to answer this question, one of the reviewers, who I suspect might have been Chalmers himself, said, but this is a metaphysical problem. It can't be solved. It's not open to solution. And my co-author, Carl Friston, said, it seems the hard problem is not here to be solved, but rather to be revered. Now, I told you that this emphasis on the word a clue is mine and not Nagel's. And the reason that I've placed that emphasis there is that I wanted to remind myself to tell you this, that what I hope to do in this presentation to you today and tomorrow is not to answer the hard problem of consciousness, but to give you a clue as to how it might be answered. So Nagel says, we must admit that no presently available conception gives us a clue about how this could be done. And I want to give you a clue. I hope that you will agree that I am able to provide you at least with a clue as to how this might be done. So here's our question. I want to put it in big letters so that it's very clear what the question is that we have to answer. Why and how is there, sorry, this shouldn't be there. Why and how is there something it's like to be an organism, something it's like for the organism? Please remember that this is our question. We must be careful not to shift the goalposts, okay? This is what you've got to hold me to at the end of my presentation. You have to ask yourself, has this guy said something about why and how there is something it's like to be an organism, something it's like for the organism? And I tell you now already, all I hope to achieve is that you will agree, well, he's given us a clue as to how this might work. Okay, so these are, I've given you direct quotations from the famous papers, the canonical papers in relation to this hard problem of consciousness. And there's some quite complicated formulations in the sentences I put on the screen. And I want to reduce this all now to one much simpler statement. And the statement I'm going to reduce it to is also a statement by Chalmers. It's in a paper that he wrote, in a book that he wrote, the year after his famous paper on the hard problem. This was a book published in 1996. And there he puts it like this. I put it in small letters. He says, how and why do neurophysiological activities produce the experience of consciousness? I think most people, certainly not philosophers, but most non-philosophers, this is how they look upon the hard problem. This is what's hard about the hard problem. In fact, there's another very well-known philosopher, Searle, who says, He says it in this lovely way in his paper, The Mystery of Consciousness. He said, how does the brain get over the hump from electrochemistry to feeling? How does electrochemistry produce feeling? That's the hard problem. And I wanted to quote it for this, like this for you, to put it down into that essence, that essential form, which, as I say, is the way that most people think of the hard problem. And I also want to point out to you that Chalmers himself actually puts the problem this way. Why do I want to do that? It's because I think that this question is an incoherent question. I think that part of the hard problem is this is the problem with the hard problem, that the question is formulated in a way that makes it insoluble. And I'll explain that to you in a moment. But now please remember, I want to make a few caveats. The first one is, I'm not a philosopher. Okay, thank God I'm not a philosopher. I'm going to approach this problem as a scientist. Scientists have a different approach to problems than philosophers who love to have insoluble problems. We in science seek to solve problems. And you'll see as I go along that I'm very much not a philosopher. I'm going to approach this matter scientifically. But it is necessary to frame the thing philosophically, to frame your question philosophically before you can address it. You have to have it set in a clear philosophical context. And it's not a philosophical trick that I'm pulling when I tell you I don't think it's possible to answer this question, and then I'm going to give you some other philosophical answer. I'm going to say, scientifically, it's not possible to answer the question if it's posed like this. You need to pose the question slightly differently, then it becomes scientifically soluble. And I hope that you will agree with me. It's not a trick. As I get there, you'll see what I mean. But please remember that I'm not caricaturing Chalmers when I say that Chalmers asks us to answer this question. How and why do neurophysiological activities produce the experience of consciousness? This is a question exactly like, how does the liver produce bile? It's as if the relationship between the brain and the mind is something like that there's an organ that excretes this thing called consciousness. And I think that although lay people generally think that the brain produces the mind, this is in fact not a very helpful way of thinking about the problem. I tried to think my way through this thing, and I came to a way of understanding it as a neuroscientist, a behavioral neuroscientist, wanting to tackle the relationship of mental processes to brain processes. You have to think this thing through. As I say, you can't do science in this area if you don't. In fact, it's dangerous to try to do science in this area if you don't know what the philosophical framework is within which you're working. So I tried to think this thing through for myself in an entirely amateurish way as a non-philosopher, and I came to a formulation in my head which made sense to me, and I'm about to describe it to you in a moment. But I subsequently discovered that the formulation I came to is in fact a well-known philosophical position, and that position is dual aspect monism, associated above all with Baruch Spinoza. What is dual aspect monism? Well, again, I repeat, I'm not a philosopher. I'm going to give you a very rough and ready, ordinary, common sense definition of what I mean by this. It works like this. When I wake up in the morning, lying in my bed with my eyes closed, I feel myself to exist. Thank God. I feel myself to be there. Like Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, I exist. That's my mind. That's my mind. It's me. I'm Mark Solms. That's my mind. Okay. Then I get out of bed and I stagger over to the bathroom, and there's a mirror, and I see this body in the mirror, and I recognize it, and I think, that's Mark Solms. That's Mark Solms's body. So there you have the mind-body problem. There's Mark Solms, the experiential being of Mark Solms, and then there's Mark Solms, that thing that you can see in the mirror, the body of Mark Solms. Now the question is, how does the one produce the other, according to the statement I just had on the screen? And I hope that even as I put it that way, you can see why I think it's an absurd question. These are two different perspectives on one thing. There aren't two different. There isn't Mark Solms that's produced by the other Mark Solms. There's only one Mark Solms. That's me. There's me, my mind, that's the being of Mark Solms, and there's me, my body, that's the external appearance of Mark Solms, the internal appearance of Mark Solms, the external appearance of Mark Solms. They are two different observational perspectives on the same thing. It's like to ask how the one produces the other is as odd a question to my mind as to ask how does lightning produce thunder? You know, there's one thing which you see with your eyes, lightning, and then you hear it with your ears, ba-ba-ba-boom-ba, thunder. These are two different appearances of one and the same thing. To ask how does the flash cause the bang is to ask really a silly question. So it's against that, within that framework, that I want to return to this question of the two different Mark Solmses. Clearly there aren't two different Mark Solmses, there's only one. And there are two different perspectives upon the same thing. So if we want to solve the hard problem, we have to frame it within this, I think, much more commonsensical, much more naturalistic, much more realistic. Remember, I'm not a philosopher. In philosophy, in this problem, you can just take any position you like. And, you know, you just say, well, I'm a dual aspect monist. Oh, really, I'm a materialist monist. Me, I'm an idealist, you know, etc. You can do what you like. But to me, as a scientist, it's just like absolutely commonsensical that my mental experience is the being of my body. And my external perception of that body is the same thing observed from the outside. And so you can't ask how does the one produce the other. You have to ask a different sort of question. So let me start addressing this different sort of question in relation to the field that we're dealing with, in order to illustrate that I'm not talking about something spooky. Although I have to concede there is something spooky about that question. Let me put it to you bluntly. If I say, which is the easy part, to say that guy in the mirror, the body of Mark Solms, is the same thing as this guy I'm experiencing myself to be. There aren't two of us. There's only one of us. And these are two different ways that you can experience it, depending on whether you're inside that body or outside that body. You see it in two different ways. You experience it in two different ways. That's easy to say. The difficult problem is, well, if there are two different appearances of Mark Solms, then what is the monist part? These are dual aspects of one thing. If that thing is neither the body nor the mind, then what the hell is it? That's where it starts to sound a bit weird. And that's the problem you're left with if you start with this commonsensical statement that I believe is just that, a commonsensical statement, that the mind of Mark Solms is the subjective being of the body of Mark Solms, that these are two different perspectives on the same thing. It begs the question, well, what is the thing then, that these are two perspectives upon? And I'm wanting to address that question by way of these two images, in fact three, that I'm about to show you. So here's the first image. Those of you who neuroscientists will recognize this is an optogenetic image. What you have no reason to know is that it's an optogenetic image of neurons in the amygdala, in the laterobasal amygdala of a mouse. And this mouse is busy, has just had activated in it a fear memory, the fear memory of a cat. So the mouse has been frightened by the image of a cat. It's been shown an image of a cat. I'll show you the image in a moment. And this is what happens in the mouse's amygdala. Okay, so if you look at the mouse from the outside, what you see is the mouse looking like that. And then if you scan the mouse's brain, you know, if you have an fMRI image of the brain, you see is actually something going on in its amygdala. And then if you use this method, you can actually see the actual neurons that are activated. This is the fear memory. This is the physiological, neurophysiological memory. Looked at from the outside, you can get right down to this level of detail of what the bodily appearance of a fear memory is. Here is the same memory experienced from the inside. Okay, here's what the mouse saw. It saw like that, okay, and it had like this. That was its experience. Now remember, this is the image that the mouse saw. You must remember the actual experience the mouse had was shit. Okay, that feeling. So that feeling is the fear memory. And this image is the fear memory also. So the question is, if the memory is both this external, observable, bodily, physiological, anatomical thing, and the memory is the experience that the poor little mouse had, then what is the memory itself? That's the question. What is the underlying thing called memory? Well, the underlying thing called memory is an abstraction. It's a function. It's a function called memory. And we study it in cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience, neuropsychology, behavioral neuroscience. We study this thing called memory. And here is the most famous basic little model of what we've learned about memory. We've learned that memory is divided into a whole lot of different systems, that there are declarative memory systems and there are non-declarative memory systems, and those can be divided into subsystems, which you can observe in their anatomical manifestations. These are the anatomical locations of these different systems, slightly oversimplified. And each one of these systems, I could give you a 10-hour lecture about how these different aspects of memory work. We've learned the laws governing memory. Memory, I say again, is an abstract thing. It's a function. So it's not something spooky. I'm not saying there's some thing in itself called Mark Solms that you can never see because it, blah, blah, blah. I'm not saying anything clever and philosophical like that. I'm saying as a scientist, we study all the time. As a neuropsychologist, behavioral neuroscientist, anyone who's looking at the relationship between mental processes and brain processes, all the time the conclusions we come to are formulated in this language. Memory itself is a function. Language itself is a function. Perception itself is a function. All of these things are functions. And what we want to do is to discern the functional laws that explain the observations. So there you have my answer to the question, well then what is Mark Solms himself? Mark Solms himself is an abstraction. Okay? Each one of us there's a functional organization that explains why our bodies behave the way they do, and that same set of functional laws has to explain our experiences if we have actually got a scientific account of mental life. Remember again what I said about Freud. Freud was trying to do this with his meta-psychology. He was saying, these are the experiences. What lies behind them? Let's try and infer the laws that explain the experiences. And he couldn't go any further than psychological laws, but he hoped one day it would be possible to link them up with neuroscience. How would you do that? It would be through the functional laws. From neuroscience, so you have a psychoanalytic theory of memory, and nowadays we have very deeply elaborated psychological theories of memory that explain the experiences of memory in terms of underlying mechanisms, functional laws, and those same functional laws explain the anatomy and physiology of memory. That's what we do all the time. It's really nothing special. There are things like Miller's law, for example. Miller's law explains the experience of short-term memory, that it's more or less impossible to hold more than 7 or at most 9 bits of information in consciousness at any point in time. That's Miller's law. The capacity of short-term memory is 7 plus or minus 2. It's a law. And you can experience that law in terms of you try and hold more bits of information than that in your consciousness now. You won't be able to. It's a law. And so that same law explains into the physiology of short-term memory in terms of neurotransmitter uptake, reuptake, why it's not possible to hold in the buffer of short-term memory more than 7 bits of information. There's a neurophysiological explanation that ultimately comes down to the same law. So the Miller's law, via these intermediate levels of explanation, explains the two sets of phenomena. And that's why I say I come down ultimately to this very rough and ready abstraction. This is memory itself. That's what memory is. It's a function. It's a mechanism. It's a thing that explains the observables. And when it comes to the brain, it has 2 different ways of being observed. The one is the experiencing of it from the inside, the being of having a memory, the actual experience of a reminiscence, and then there's the external thing of the neural trace of it. 2 different appearances of one and the same thing. The same thing is the underlying functional mechanism. Okay, that's all that I mean by dual aspect monism. So that makes our task easy. Now we return to the problem of consciousness. All that we have to do is we have to define the mechanism of consciousness. We mustn't say, how does the brain produce the experience? We say you have experiences, that's the subjective perspective, Then you have the neural correlates of those experiences, the NCC. That's the external perspective. And you want to have an underlying set of laws, some mechanism that explains why experience feels like this and why experience looks like that from the anatomical and physiological point of view. You see, that is our problem. It's not how does the lightning cause the thunder. It's what is the thing that we experience in these two different ways. Well, the thing of lightning is electrical discharge. That's the mechanism. And you can describe it in beautiful abstract physics, how electricity works. And then you look at it with your eye, you see flashes. You listen to it with your ear, you hear bangs. Okay, that's what we're looking for, an underlying mechanism of consciousness. Not how does the one form, the one appearance cause the other or produce the other appearance. That's an absurdity. So I say again, if you formulate the hard problem like that, you can't solve it. It's no more soluble than asking, how does lightning produce thunder? It doesn't. It's two appearances of one and the same mechanism. So our task then becomes, what is the mechanism of consciousness? It has to explain both appearances. That's what we're looking for. And you have to be able to causally manipulate this thing and, etc. It has to function like laws, like everything else in science. But that's what we're looking for. So now I come to explaining to you why there's this bizarre question. Is consciousness not a cognitive function? I mean, why can't we just do this thing with consciousness that we can do with anything else? Chalmers says we can't. And here's a long quote from Chalmers. This is just half of the quote. Okay? Chalmers, in his famous paper, says the following. The easy problems, and remember, I've told you what the easy problems are. Those are correlations. The easy problems are easy precisely because they concern the explanation of cognitive abilities and functions. As I've just told you, that can be done. It's done with memory, done with language, done with perception, etc. Chalmers carries on. To explain a cognitive function, we need only specify a mechanism that can perform the function. The methods of cognitive science are well suited for this sort of explanation, and so are well suited to the easy problems of consciousness. By contrast, the hard problem is hard precisely because it's not a problem about the performance of functions. The problem persists even when the performance of all the relevant functions is explained. What makes the hard problem hard and almost unique, I don't know how you can have an almost unique thing, but that's another matter. What makes the hard problem hard and almost unique is that it goes beyond problems about the performance of functions. To see this, note that even when we've explained the performance of all the cognitive and behavioral functions in the vicinity of experience, there may still remain a further unanswered question. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? A simple explanation of the functions leaves this question open. Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? Okay, so now I've introduced a whole new level of this problem. I told you, well, it should be soluble. I told you how one would normally go about trying to solve a problem like this. Consciousness surely is just another mental function, like memory is, like perception is, like language is. We've got methods. You take the experiential side of it and you take the physiological, anatomical side of it. You study both sides of it and you infer what are the underlying laws that explain these appearances. That's what you do. Why can't we do this with consciousness? Chalmers says you can't do it with consciousness because when you do it, you find the mechanism, but you're still left with this question. Why does this mechanism have to feel like something? That's what's unique about consciousness, is that there's an experience of being that mechanism. And no amount of finding the underlying mechanisms is going to explain how and why what it is like feeling of being that thing comes about. So that, and there are many philosophical things I can tell you here. I'll give you one. It's called the knowledge argument. That there's this, I'm going to slightly simplify the argument. There's this visual neuroscientist called Mary, but she's blind. And She knows everything there is to know about vision. She can explain how the physics of light works, how the photons activate the rods and the cones, these photosensitive cells in the retina of the eye, how this gets transduced into a nerve impulse, how this travels along the optic nerve to the lateral geniculate body, and there it goes to visual cortex, occipital lobe, and there it is processed, by these layers and columns of neurons, and in all of these different modules, and we know it all. She knows, Mary knows it all, how vision works. All of it. From the physics to the physiology and anatomy to the neuropsychology of it. Mary is the expert, but remember, Mary is blind. So that means Mary has never had a visual experience in her life. Now, if, thanks God, Mary is suddenly gifted with the capacity to see, to have visual experience, she's no longer blind. She will learn, says the person the philosopher behind this, whose name's Jackson, says the philosophers, she will have learn something utterly new about vision. That is, what is it like to see deep blue? What is it like, the quality, the experience of redness? No amount of knowledge of the physics and physiology and whatnot of vision would ever have equipped Mary with knowledge about what the experience of vision is like. And so, says Jackson, therefore the experience is not accounted for by the mechanism. You can know everything you like about the mechanism. You're not going to explain the experience. The experience is something utterly different that is not accounted for by the mechanism. So it's that sort of thing that Chalmers is alluding to here when he says that even, what does he say? That after you've explained the performance of all the cognitive and behavioral functions in the vicinity of experience, there may still remain a further unanswered question. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? A simple explanation of the functions leaves this question open. Why doesn't all of this information processing, like visual information processing, why doesn't it go on in the dark? Why does it have to have something that it's like? Why does it have to feel like something? So that's why I've asked this odd question when I say, is consciousness not a cognitive function? Chalmers is saying it's not. Okay, you get it. How am I doing for time? My God. It's an hour. Shall I talk for 5 minutes, you say? Yeah, we want to. Yeah, I've spoken for an hour. Yeah. Okay, so here we have another question we've got to answer. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? So remember, I put this in bold letters again because this is what you've got to hold me to when I say I'm going to give you a clue as to how we can answer these questions. I want to go back to the previous one. Why and how is there something it is like to be an organism, something it's like for the organism? That, remember, is the essence of the how and why question. And then, more specifically, there's this question. Why is the performance of these functions, the way we would normally go about answering these questions in cognitive neuroscience, why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't the information processing go on in the dark? Why does this phenomenal feel come with it? Okay, that's the question. So where I'm going to next, and I'll have to stop now so that I can take some questions and we'll carry on tomorrow. Agreed, Eric? Yeah. Where I'm going to go to tomorrow is I'm going to tell you why this problem, this specific problem that I've just quoted to you from Chalmers, why this problem arises is precisely because things like vision are not intrinsically conscious functions. That's why somebody like Mary can understand everything there is to know about the mechanism of vision. It's because vision is not intrinsically conscious. And that it's the wrong place to look if you want to understand the function of consciousness. Cognition is a fundamentally unconscious business. And that's where we're going next, episode 2. So now some questions. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Yes.
I'd like to know if it could relate to research. I'm just reading, so I'm not sure I even understand it. Lifer, in which it seems like we figure things out and do it, and then consciousness comes into play after we've already made the decision. So I'm not sure if it's at this point or later on, but I'd be interested in your thoughts about that.
Okay. Well, as it happens, that was where I was going to go next. So I can show you this slide while I answer your question. This is a famous review paper by Barge and Chartrand, published in the American Psychologist with this beautiful title, The Unbearable Automaticity of Being, in which they review all the cognitive neuroscience literature and point out that so much, in fact, they end up quantifying it. They're saying 95% of our moment-to-moment psychological activities are unconscious. In other words, 95% of our goal-directed volitional activities are unconsciously executed. Only 5% are conscious. And they go into it in great depth and make the point that it doesn't appear as if you need consciousness in order to perform all of these functions. And really, this applies to a hell of a lot of functions. And the ones that are not, and there was also the famous paper by Kielstrom, which has got the title Learning Without Awareness, Perception Without Awareness, and Learning with, or something like that, without awareness. That we can do all of these cognitive things, and we don't need awareness in order to be able to do them. And the sort of most striking examples are that you can show people words so quickly on a tachistoscope that they don't realize that they've had any experience, that they've seen anything, let alone that it was a word, let alone that they've read the word, let alone that they've understood the word. But you can demonstrate this experimentally by their subsequent actions. So you can show that you are differentially able to influence what the research subject does next by showing them, for example, pleasant versus unpleasant words. And it changes their subsequent behavior. You can do the same thing with faces. You can do the same thing with many, many things. But I'm using words as my example to make the point that this is an exquisitely human cortical function. It is the pinnacle, of our cognitive capacities, that we can read and understand these symbols and decode them. It's amazing. But even that exquisitely human cortical function does not require consciousness. There's no question about it. Now, the study that you're citing is even more extraordinary. And it's, in case anyone doesn't know it, by the way, the guy gives, you have to always let people tell you how to pronounce their names. It's one of the prerogatives of being a person is you can decide what your name how it should sound. And Benjamin Libet says his name is Libet. So I'll grant him that. Benjamin Libet did this extraordinary experiment. I'll tell those who might not know it. That the research participants, there was a huge clock face. It had to be huge because it was only 1 second. The hand went around the clock face in 1 second, and it's quite difficult in a little clock face to see. It's such quick rotation. So with a big hand, you can see more easily where it is in the second. And so what Libet asked these research participants to do was to lift a finger voluntarily of their own free will. So they could decide at any moment, I'm going to lift my finger and do it. Okay, this is pure free will. You can do it any time you like. But says Libet that when you make the decision to do it, take note of where the hand is on the clock face. And what he and then he put an EEG on the skull, on the outside of the scalp of these research participants, measuring the electrical activity over the motor cortex, and in particular an area called the supplementary motor area, which is premotor cortex, which is where you see the preparation for movement. And there's a particular EEG pattern that you see. It's called the readiness potential, which is the premotor cortex busy firing up to fire the pyramidal neurons in the motor cortex. And what Libet showed was that the premotor readiness potential preceded the decision, conscious decision, to move the finger by roughly 300 milliseconds. And since then, other people have replicated this study, and other people have showed even longer latencies. You know? So it is astonishing that you can show physiologically the brain is starting to execute the movement 300 milliseconds before the person even has the conscious thought that they're going to make the movement. And the standard interpretation of this experiment is that it proves that the consciousness adds nothing. The consciousness is it's an illusion that you are making the... Remember what I said about Crick. You, your joys and your sorrows, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact nothing more than the behavior of a vast assembly of neurons and their associated molecules. So that's the real thing. That's actually making the decisions. And then there's you floating over there saying, oh, I'm going to do this. And the consciousness adds nothing. That's the standard view of it. Actually, Benjamin Libet has a different view of it. But he's in the minority. The guy who did the experiment says he thinks consciousness, he calls it free won't rather than free will. He says consciousness has the capacity to intervene and stop the movement. You can decide not to do it. That was his view. But that's not the general view. Now, you ask me, how do I explain that? At this point in my talk, I can't tell you. It'll have to be held over until tomorrow. But I am going to return to that. I think it's a very good example, both of the problem we're talking about. Where does consciousness fit in to this physiological, anatomical account of things? What does it add? What is it for? Because that's precisely the question that's arisen out of the general statement that I've made to you, which is that cognition is a fundamentally unconscious process. And the cognition as to when am I going to move my finger, the conscious cognition doesn't seem to be actually the thing that's driving the movement of the finger. And I think that that's a very good example of the problem. I'm going to propose a solution, and when I do, if I don't remember myself, please remind me, and I'll come back to answering it. Yeah.
But this is like, you think that I think, I don't know if you'll answer it
Yes.
afterwards or...
Yes. Well, I think that it's an important question to address as soon as possible, and so I'm also very glad to have the opportunity to address it. When you say in Hebrew the words are cut differently, that applies to most languages. There are subtle nuances in the languages, you know, and this is a problem, of course, in all science. In the Royal Society in London, the best scientific society, the most prestigious scientific society in Britain, it's called the Royal Society. And over the door in Latin, it says, no words here. And this is partly the ideal of the Berlin Physical Society, is we want to reduce things to laws and numbers. You know, we don't want these descriptions and qualitative things. But although there are different words in different languages, in philosophy of mind these days, and in neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience these days, there's a sort of general consensus about there being two aspects to consciousness. And there are different words given to these two aspects. But perhaps the simplest is to say primary consciousness and secondary consciousness, or phenomenal consciousness and reflective consciousness. It's also called the raw feel, as opposed to access consciousness. And you know, all these different words that different philosophers use. But what it boils down to is the exact distinction that you've just made, which is that there's the qualitative feel, that's something very raw and basic and phenomenal, and then there's the reflective cognition about that feel. It's me who's having this thought. I am an abstraction. You know, I have decided to do such and such because I feel such and such. So that's reflective consciousness, higher order thoughts, secondary consciousness, access consciousness. All these different words are used for it. The important point that I would like to emphasize, if you think back to what Chalmers and Nagel were saying in those early statements that I had on the screen, they're talking about phenomenal consciousness. They're talking about the most basic, raw, nuts and bolts ingredients They're called qualia. That's the words the philosophers love to use. The individual, the singular is the quale, and the plural is qualia, which is the qualities. What Chalmers described as the quality of deep blue, or the quality of middle sea, or redness, blueness, and so on. It's that qualitative thing that Mary, the visual neuroscientist, could never experience, despite all of her reflective thoughts about vision. She'd never had the feel, the something it is like to have the experience. So it's important that you've raised that question, because many people, I think most people, our beloved Freud included, for the most part, when he used the word consciousness, and most people, when they use the word consciousness, they mean higher order consciousness, secondary consciousness, reflective consciousness, awareness of your feelings, about your feeling, rather than the feeling, the raw feel itself. So I say again, sorry, the hard problem is a problem of how do you explain the qualia? How do you explain the phenomenal raw stuff of consciousness? And therefore, it's the first of the two aspects. It's the simpler in the form of consciousness, but in order to explain secondary consciousness, first you have to explain primary consciousness. And so I'm happy to tackle it in that way when I get to it tomorrow. You wanted to say something more, though?
Awareness is also first consciousness experience.
Yes, it's also a subjective, it can only, yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And then if we're the therapy playing with feelings, experiences, a very big potential.
Yes.
Making things experience.
Absolutely. No, secondary consciousness is still consciousness. It's just that it's a more complex version of primary consciousness. If you can't explain primary consciousness, you're never going to explain secondary consciousness. Once you've explained primary consciousness, you then have a further task of explaining secondary consciousness. And I don't know how much time I'll have tomorrow to get to that level of complexity, but I'm going to be addressing the primary, raw quality of consciousness. That's the nub of the problem.
So as therapists,
As therapists, yeah.
what is interesting is how we evoke
Yes.
the feeling, the consciousness
Yes.
experience. And in this way, the relationship is very important.
Yes.
Not to explain and
It's very important because, as I said, Freud, when he speaks, when he says, where id was, there shall ego be, that the talking cure, that you're trying to undo repressions, you're trying to bring things back to consciousness, he doesn't mean just have feelings. He means you're trying to have reflective awareness and ownership of your feelings and so on. So I completely agree with you. When it comes to the clinical, our aspiration to broaden or deepen or expand the consciousness of our patients, we're talking about secondary consciousness. I agree. Yes, please. Okay. So I'll answer. That'll be my last comment because, as you can see, my boss is coming up. I'll answer it like this. The question, by the way, is, do I think that artificially intelligent machines will ever have also the quality of consciousness? So it's not just a matter of intelligence, but their sentient being aware of their own existence, so them having qualitative, something it is like to be the machine. Will they ever feel it? So artificial intelligence came via the behaviorist tradition when it began. So somebody like Turing, Alan Turing, who was the inventor, as it were, of the computer, and the first person to start thinking about these things. He was of the view that his computers had an intelligence. And he said that people who don't accept this are prejudiced. By the way, interestingly, he was gay and knew everything about prejudice. So he said, you mustn't look at the thing, and like in racism, you see the visual evidence of your prejudice, and then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. He said, what you need to do is not see what you're interacting with. You have to interact with it via a computer screen. With one of these things, you communicate to the computer, and if when it answers you, you can't tell whether you're dealing with a human being or a computer, then it's only prejudice to say that that thing does not have intelligence when you discover it's a computer. That's the Turing test. Technically, the Turing test requires 30% of judges who are blind to what they're interacting with. If 30% of them think they're interacting with a human being or can't tell, then you have to say that the thing is intelligent. But please note the word is intelligent, and also it's a behaviorist test. The cognitive scientists took over the whole behaviorist sort of approach in more ways than one. I don't want to go down in that story. But I always thought, oh, that's behaviorist nonsense. Just because the thing's able to sound as if it's a human being and fool us with its behavior, that says nothing about whether or not it has a mind. And the essential property of the mind is that there is something it is like to be a mind. And so it's not about intelligence, it's about consciousness, as you've just asked the question. Now, until a few years ago, a very few years ago, that was my view. Since I've tackled this problem, the hard problem of consciousness, if you bear in mind what I'm busy arguing, I'm saying I'm hoping to convince you tomorrow that it is possible to identify an underlying mechanism that causes both the brain processes and explains them both. There's an underlying functional organization that manifests in these two different ways. How do you know you've got that right if you distill it down to some basic laws? I think the only way you can prove that that is the causal mechanism of consciousness is you should be able to reverse engineer it. You should be able to say, okay, if this is the function, the mechanism that produces consciousness, then go on, make it. So I think that is the test of the hard problem of consciousness. If you're going to give a functional, mechanistic account of consciousness, you should be able to reverse engineer it. So in my last years, me, the biologist of the mind, who always thought this is nonsense, it's not possible to make artificial consciousness, I'm now, I'm afraid, changing my mind. And I, having I think, gained some insight into a clue that will explain how consciousness mechanistically is caused, I'm afraid to tell you, I think we can probably produce it in a simple form. Thank you all very much.